Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. On the afternoon of December 18, 1979, at approximately 2:47 p.m., CIA Technical Services Officer Thomas Michael Garrett sat in a climate-controlled viewing room on the third floor of the Central Intelligence Agency's Langley headquarters in Virginia, watching a videotape recorded 4 days earlier by a surveillance camera concealed inside a hollowed-out traffic signal box on Massachusetts Avenue in northwest Washington, D.C. The viewing room, designated TSR-14 in internal CIA documents, measured approximately 12 feet by 14 feet and contained 3 Sony Trinitron monitors, a JVC CR8200U video cassette recorder, a legal pad, and a metal folding chair. The room had no windows. The only sounds were the mechanical whir of the VCR and the occasional scratch of Garrett's pen against paper as he documented what he observed. Garrett, 34 years old, had been working in the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology for 6 years, specializing in the analysis of technical surveillance footage. He held a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Michigan and had completed additional training in photographic analysis at the CIA's facility in rural Virginia, known internally as the Farm. He was married to Linda, a high school mathematics teacher, and they had one daughter, Jessica, who was 3 years old. By all accounts, Garrett's work life was methodical and unremarkable. He reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage each month, documenting vehicle movements, photographing faces, noting times and patterns, producing reports that were filed and reviewed by case officers and analysts in other divisions. The surveillance camera that had captured the footage Garrett was reviewing had been installed on November 3, 1979, as part of Operation Lighthouse, a joint FBI-CIA initiative to enhance technical surveillance capabilities targeting Soviet diplomatic personnel in Washington. The operation had been authorized following intelligence assessments indicating that Soviet intelligence activities in the United States Capitol had increased significantly during 1979, coinciding with deteriorating U.S. Soviet relations over Afghanistan, arms control negotiations, and various regional conflicts. The camera itself represented what was, at the time, cutting-edge surveillance technology. Unlike traditional photographic surveillance, which required agents to manually operate cameras from concealed positions, the new system utilized remote-controlled video cameras that could record continuously onto magnetic tape. The cameras were equipped with motorized zoom lenses that could be operated from a control station located several blocks away, allowing surveillance teams to capture close-up footage of faces, documents, and exchanges without requiring direct line of sight from a manned position. The system had been developed over a 3-year period by contractors working with the CIA's Office of Technical Service at a cost of approximately $780,000 for the initial deployment of 12 cameras at strategic locations throughout Washington. The particular camera that had recorded the footage Garrett was reviewing had been positioned to monitor a section of Massachusetts Avenue between 31st Street Northwest and 34th Street Northwest, a stretch of road that included several foreign embassies, including the Soviet Embassy compound. The camera's position inside the traffic signal housing provided an elevated vantage point approximately 18 feet above street level, with an unobstructed view of both the sidewalk and the roadway. The tape Garrett was watching had been recorded on December 14, 1979, between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The format was continuous surveillance footage, meaning the camera had recorded everything that occurred within its field of view during those 9 hours. Reviewing such footage was, by necessity, a tedious process. Garrett's assignment was to identify and document any individuals who appeared in the footage and who matched photographs of known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. He was also instructed to note any unusual behaviors, meetings, or exchanges that might warrant further investigation. The first 3 hours of the tape showed routine activity: pedestrians walking past, vehicles driving by, a postal worker delivering mail to nearby buildings, a woman with a stroller stopping to adjust her child's blanket. At 12:17 p.m., according to the time code burned into the bottom of the video frame, a black Volvo sedan appeared in frame, driving slowly eastbound on Massachusetts Avenue. The vehicle pulled to the curb approximately 40 feet from the camera's position and stopped. Garrett made a note. 12:17 p.m., black Volvo, DC plates, pulls to curb. He continued watching. The driver's side door opened, and a man exited the vehicle. Through the camera's lens, Garrett could see that the man appeared to be in his early 40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a thick mustache. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat, dark slacks, and leather shoes. He carried a brown leather briefcase in his right hand. Garrett pressed pause on the VCR and zoomed in on the frozen frame using a magnifying loupe, examining the man's face. He then retrieved a 3-ring binder from a shelf beside the monitors, a photographic reference guide containing images of Soviet diplomatic personnel currently assigned to Washington. He flipped through the plastic-sleeved pages until he found a match. The man was Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, age 42, officially listed as a cultural affairs officer at the Soviet embassy. According to the file summary attached to his photograph, Sokolov had arrived in Washington in June 1978 with his wife, Galina, and their teenage son, Sergei. His stated diplomatic responsibilities involved coordinating educational exchanges, cultural exhibitions, and similar programs. However, CIA and FBI intelligence assessments, based on analysis of his background, his contacts, and his activities, concluded with high confidence that Sokolov's actual position was as a case officer with the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for intelligence collection and possibly for managing American assets. Garrett made another note. Subject identified: Yuri Sokolov, Soviet Embassy, suspected KGB. He released the pause button and continued watching. On the screen, Sokolov walked around to the front of his vehicle and opened the hood, as if inspecting the engine. He appeared to look under the hood for approximately 30 seconds, then closed it. He walked back to the driver's side, reached inside, and appeared to manipulate something, perhaps the ignition key or a dashboard control. Then he closed the driver's door and walked to the rear of the vehicle, where he opened the trunk. From the trunk, Sokolov removed what appeared to be a red emergency triangle, the kind used to warn other motorists of a disabled vehicle. He carried this to a position approximately 20 feet in front of his car and placed it on the sidewalk. He then returned to his vehicle, leaned into the trunk again, and retrieved what looked like a small toolbox. He carried this to the front of the vehicle, set it on the ground beside the front tire, and knelt down as if examining the tire or perhaps preparing to change it. To any casual observer, Sokolov's actions would have appeared entirely unremarkable, a motorist experiencing car trouble, taking appropriate steps to address the problem. But Garrett, trained to recognize deviations from normal patterns, noticed several details that troubled him. First, Sokolov had not actually appeared to do anything substantive when he had opened the hood. He had looked under it, but had not touched any components, had not checked oil or fluid levels, had not done any of the things one would normally do when investigating a mechanical problem. Second, the placement of the warning triangle seemed unusual. Standard practice would be to place such a triangle on the roadway, not on the sidewalk, to warn approaching traffic. Third, Sokolov's body language while kneeling by the tire did not suggest someone actually working on a vehicle. His hands moved, but the movements appeared performative rather than purposeful. Garrett watched as Sokolov remained in position beside the front tire for approximately 4 minutes. During this time, several pedestrians walked past without stopping or showing any interest. A few vehicles drove by. Then, at 12:24 p.m., according to the time code, a woman approached from the direction of 34th Street, walking westbound on the same side of Massachusetts Avenue where Sokolov's vehicle was parked. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair. She wore a tan raincoat, dark pants, and carried a large leather handbag over her left shoulder. She walked at a steady pace, neither hurried nor slow, and appeared to be looking straight ahead as she approached. As she reached the position where Sokolov was kneeling, she appeared to glance down at him, a natural reaction to seeing someone beside a disabled vehicle. Sokolov looked up at her. Through the camera's lens, Garrett could see what appeared to be a brief exchange. The woman appeared to say something, Sokolov appeared to respond, the interaction lasting no more than 5 or 6 seconds. Then the woman continued walking, passing the vehicle and continuing westbound down Massachusetts Avenue. Garrett made a note. 12:24 p.m. Female subject, late 20s, early 30s, brief interaction with Sokolov, continues walking. He continued watching, expecting nothing further of significance. But what happened next would eventually lead to one of the most extensive counterintelligence investigations of the early 1980s. Approximately 45 seconds after the woman had passed Sokolov's vehicle, she stopped walking. She was now approximately 60 feet past Sokolov's position near the corner of 31st Street. She stopped, opened her handbag, and appeared to search for something inside. She withdrew what might have been a handkerchief or tissue, used it to wipe her nose or face, and then placed it back inside the handbag. Then she turned around and began walking back in the direction she had come from, back toward where Sokolov was still kneeling beside his vehicle. Garrett sat up straighter in his chair. This was unusual. The woman had walked past the vehicle, had continued for nearly a full block, had then turned around and walked back. There could be innocent explanations. Perhaps she had forgotten something. Perhaps she had realized she was walking in the wrong direction. But in the context of watching a known KGB officer engaged in what might be a staged scenario, the reversal of direction was notable. As the woman approached Sokolov's vehicle for the second time, she appeared to maintain the same steady walking pace. As she passed the vehicle again, she appeared to glance down at Sokolov again, and again there seemed to be a brief moment of eye contact or acknowledgement, but she did not stop walking. She continued eastbound past the vehicle and eventually exited the camera's field of view. Garrett rewound the tape and watched the sequence again, this time using the VCR's frame-by-frame advance feature to examine the interaction more closely. During the woman's first pass, when she had briefly exchanged words with Sokolov, Garrett could see through the grainy video that Sokolov had made a small gesture with his right hand, almost a pointing motion, but subtle, lasting less than a second. The woman had nodded, or at least moved her head in a way that suggested acknowledgement, and then continued walking. During the woman's second pass, approximately 90 seconds later, Garrett noticed something he had missed on the first viewing. As the woman walked past Sokolov's vehicle the second time, she appeared to adjust the leather handbag on her shoulder, shifting it from her left shoulder to her right shoulder. The movement appeared natural, unremarkable. But Garrett, trained to look for communication signals in surveillance footage, recognized that such adjustments could serve as signals, confirmation that a message had been received, that instructions had been understood, that a meeting would or would not occur. After the woman had passed out of frame the second time, Sokolov remained beside his vehicle for approximately another 2 minutes. Then he stood, collected the toolbox, carried it back to the trunk, placed it inside, closed the trunk, retrieved the red warning triangle from the sidewalk, placed that in the trunk as well, closed the trunk, returned to the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away. The entire incident had lasted approximately 8 minutes. From the time Sokolov had first pulled to the curb until the time he drove away, Garrett completed his review of the remaining footage on the tape. Another 5.5 hours showing routine pedestrian and vehicle traffic with nothing else of note. He made his standard documentation. Time codes for significant events, descriptions of individuals observed, actions taken, and his assessment. In the assessment section of his report, he wrote, "Subject Yuri Sokolov engaged in what may be counter-surveillance activity or signaling operation. Vehicle trouble appears staged. Interaction with unidentified female subject requires further investigation to determine whether contact was coincidental or coordinated. The report was typed, copied, and distributed according to standard procedures. One copy went to Garrett's supervisor in the Technical Services Division. One copy went to the FBI's Washington Field Office as part of the established information sharing protocol for Soviet counterintelligence operations. One copy was filed in the operational folder for Yuri Sokolov, and one copy was forwarded to CIA counterintelligence staff for review. Under normal circumstances, Garrett's report would have been reviewed, noted, and filed alongside thousands of other surveillance reports documenting the daily movements and activities of Soviet diplomatic personnel. The incident on Massachusetts Avenue, a brief roadside encounter between a suspected KGB officer and an unidentified woman, was, in isolation, insufficient to warrant significant investigative resources. It could have been exactly what it appeared to be: a motorist with car trouble, a passing pedestrian offering brief sympathy or assistance, nothing more. But on December 21, 1979, 3 days after Garrett had submitted his report, CIA counterintelligence officer Jennifer Hammond was conducting a routine review of recent surveillance reports when something caught her attention. Hammond, 38 years old, had been working counterintelligence cases for 13 years. She had a master's degree in Slavic languages from Georgetown University and had completed extensive training in Soviet intelligence operational methods. One of her responsibilities was to identify patterns across multiple surveillance reports that might indicate coordinated intelligence activities. Hammond retrieved surveillance reports from the previous 6 weeks and began cross-referencing them. She was looking specifically for any other instances of Soviet diplomatic personnel engaging in unusual roadside stops, staged vehicle troubles, or encounters with unidentified American civilians. What she found was a pattern that had not been immediately apparent when viewing individual reports in isolation. On November 8, 1979, a different Soviet diplomat, Dmitry Orlov, officially a second secretary in the Soviet Embassy's Economic Affairs section, had been observed by FBI surveillance pulling his vehicle to the curb on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown and spending approximately 12 minutes inspecting what appeared to be a flat tire. During this time, 2 pedestrians had walked past and had brief interactions with Orlov. The FBI surveillance team had photographed both pedestrians but had not been able to identify either individual at the time, and the incident had been filed as likely routine. On November 22, 1979, a third Soviet diplomat, Anton Fedorov, a press attaché, had been observed pulling to the side of Rock Creek Parkway and opening his vehicle's hood, apparently experiencing engine trouble. He had remained in this position for approximately 15 minutes. During that time, several vehicles had passed, and at least 3 pedestrians had walked by on the nearby trail. One of those pedestrians, a man in his 30s wearing jogging attire, had stopped and appeared to offer assistance. After a brief conversation, the jogger had continued running, and Fedorov had eventually closed his hood and driven away. Hammond documented these incidents alongside Garrett's report regarding Yuri Sokolov. 3 separate Soviet diplomatic personnel, all suspected by U.S. intelligence of being KGB officers, all engaging in very similar behavior: staged vehicle trouble, roadside stops, brief interactions with passing civilians over a 6-week period. Individually, each incident could be dismissed as coincidental. Collectively, they suggested a pattern. The pattern suggested what intelligence professionals called a planned encounter or brush contact operation, a technique for a case officer and an asset to make brief contact in a manner that would appear entirely innocent to any observer. The vehicle trouble provided the pretext and the timing mechanism. The case officer would pull over at a predetermined time and location, creating a stationary position that the asset could locate reliably. The asset would walk past at an agreed-upon time, and the brief interaction, perhaps just a glance, perhaps a few exchanged words, would allow for signal passing or brief communication. The entire encounter would last only seconds, would appear completely natural to any casual observer, and would leave minimal evidence of coordination. Hammond's assessment was sufficiently concerning that on December 23, 1979, she scheduled a meeting with senior CIA counterintelligence officials and their FBI counterparts to discuss the pattern and to propose enhanced surveillance and investigation. The meeting took place on December 27, 1979, at CIA headquarters in a secure conference room on the 4th floor. Present at the meeting were Hammond, her supervisor at CIA, 3 additional CIA counterintelligence analysts, 2 FBI special agents from the Washington Field Office's Soviet section, and an FBI linguist specialist. The consensus reached at this meeting was that the pattern of incidents warranted a focused investigative effort to identify the American civilians who had been observed interacting with Soviet diplomatic personnel during these roadside encounters. The investigation was given an operational code name, Blind Spot, and resources were allocated for intensive surveillance, photographic analysis, and record checks. The investigation would focus initially on the woman who had been captured on video interacting with Yuri Sokolov on December 14th. The CIA technical team was tasked with enhancing the surveillance footage to produce the clearest possible images of the woman's face. The FBI was tasked with attempting to identify her by comparing the enhanced images against existing databases. Criminal records, security clearance applications, passport photographs, driver's license records, and any other available photographic databases. The technical enhancement process took approximately 2 weeks. CIA imaging specialists transferred the surveillance footage from the original videotape to higher resolution formats, applied digital filtering to reduce grain and improve contrast, and used frame-by-frame analysis to select the images that showed the woman's face most clearly. The result was a series of 12 still photographs, each showing the woman from slightly different angles as she had walked past Yuri Sokolov's vehicle. The photographs were distributed to FBI field offices with instructions to compare them against available records. The comparison process in late 1979 and early 1980 was still largely manual, requiring investigators to physically examine filing cabinets full of photographs looking for matches. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming work with no guarantee of success. On January 18, 1980, 25 days after the original surveillance footage had been reviewed by Thomas Garrett, FBI Special Agent Raymond Kellerman was comparing the enhanced photographs from the Sokolov surveillance against security clearance application files stored at the Washington field office when he found a potential match. The file belonged to Rachel Catherine Lindström, who had applied for a security clearance in 1976 as part of her employment application for a position with the Department of State. The photograph in Lindström's security clearance file, taken in 1976, showed a woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s with straight brown hair, brown eyes, and a narrow face. Kellerman believed it was the same person captured in the surveillance footage from December 14, 1979, though she was now approximately 3 years older and her hair was styled differently. Rachel Lindström had been born in 1951 in Portland, Oregon. According to her employment file, she had graduated from Reed College in 1973 with a bachelor's degree in comparative literature and Russian language. She had spent her junior year abroad, studying in Moscow as part of a university exchange program. After graduating, she had worked for 2 years as a translator and administrative assistant at a private consulting firm in Portland before applying for and being hired by the State Department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs in 1976. Lindström's position at the State Department was classified as Foreign Service Staff, Category FSS-8, with primary responsibilities involving translation of Russian-language documents and administrative support for State Department officers working on U.S. and Soviet relations. She had been granted a secret-level security clearance in October 1976 following a standard background investigation that had found nothing disqualifying. According to employment records, Lindström lived in an apartment building in the Arlington neighborhood of Virginia, approximately 6 miles from the State Department's headquarters in Foggy Bottom. She was unmarried, lived alone, and had no children. Her personnel file indicated that her work performance had been rated as satisfactory to above average in annual reviews. There were no disciplinary issues noted. By all documentary accounts, Rachel Lindström was an ordinary, competent mid-level government employee working in a position that, while involving access to classified information, was not particularly unusual or sensitive. However, the fact that she had been observed interacting with Yuri Sokolov, a known KGB case officer, in what appeared to be a planned encounter during a staged roadside incident, immediately elevated her to the status of a potential Soviet intelligence asset. On January 19, 1980, the day after Kellerman had identified Lindström from the surveillance photographs, senior FBI and CIA officials met to discuss the investigation's next steps. The decision was made to place Lindström under intensive surveillance to document her activities, her contacts, her movements, and any behavior that might indicate intelligence activities. This surveillance would be conducted covertly, without Lindström's knowledge, and would continue until investigators either found evidence of espionage or determined that the December 14th encounter had been coincidental. The surveillance of Rachel Lindström began on January 21, 1980. FBI agents, working in rotating teams, documented her departure from her Arlington apartment building each weekday morning, typically between 7:30 and 7:45 a.m. They followed her commute, usually by metro subway, to the State Department building on C Street, NW. They noted her arrival time, typically between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m. They observed the building's entrance and exit points to document her movements during the workday, though they could not observe her activities inside the secured building without potentially compromising the investigation. They documented her departure in the evening, typically between 5 and 5:45 p.m., and followed her return to her apartment. For the first 2 weeks of surveillance, Lindström's routine appeared entirely mundane. She went to work, returned home, occasionally stopped at a grocery store or pharmacy, spent evenings at home alone, and on weekends ran errands, occasionally met friends for coffee or lunch, and attended what appeared to be social gatherings. There were no meetings with Yuri Sokolov or any other known Soviet intelligence officers. There were no visits to locations that might serve as dead drop sites. There was no suspicious behavior of any kind. Then, on February 7, 1980, Lindström's routine changed. On that evening, rather than returning directly home from work as she typically did, she boarded a metro train that took her not toward her Arlington apartment, but toward the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington. FBI agents followed at a distance. At DuPont Circle station, Lindström exited the train, walked up to street level, and entered a bookstore called The Open Book on Connecticut Avenue. The bookstore was a small independent retailer specializing in foreign language books, international newspapers and magazines, and political literature. FBI agents had previously documented that the store was frequented by various foreign nationals, including Soviet diplomatic personnel, though the store itself was not considered particularly suspicious. It simply served a niche market for people interested in foreign publications. Lindström spent approximately 23 minutes inside the bookstore, browsing shelves, apparently looking at books and magazines. FBI agents, stationed outside the store, observing through the front windows, reported that she appeared to be examining Russian-language publications. She eventually selected 2 items, what appeared to be magazines or journals, and purchased them at the counter. She then exited the store and walked to a nearby coffee shop, where she ordered coffee and sat at a small table near the window. She withdrew one of the publications she had just purchased and began reading it while drinking her coffee. FBI surveillance teams continued to observe. Lindström remained at the coffee shop for approximately 40 minutes. During that time, she read, drank coffee, and appeared to write notes in a small notebook she had withdrawn from her handbag. At approximately 7:25 p.m., she gathered her belongings, left the coffee shop, walked back to the DuPont Circle metro station, and took a train back toward Arlington, arriving at her apartment at approximately 8 p.m. The surveillance report for February 7th noted the deviation from Lindström's usual routine, but did not draw any definitive conclusions. Visiting a bookstore and reading in a coffee shop were both entirely normal activities, and the fact that Lindström read Russian-language publications was unsurprising, given that she worked as a Russian translator. However, the surveillance team did note one detail that warranted attention. During Lindström's time at the coffee shop, a man had entered the shop, had purchased coffee at the counter, and had sat at a table approximately 15 feet from where Lindström was sitting. The man had remained in the coffee shop for approximately 20 minutes, during which time he appeared to read a newspaper. He had not spoken to Lindström, and Lindström had not appeared to acknowledge his presence. The man had left the coffee shop approximately 10 minutes before Lindström did. Surveillance photographs of this man showed him to be approximately 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, with graying hair and glasses, wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather briefcase. FBI agents did not recognize him from existing files of known Soviet intelligence officers. He was logged in the surveillance report as unidentified male subject, and his photograph was flagged for further investigation. 3 days later, on February 10, 1980, Lindström returned to the Open Book bookstore on Connecticut Avenue. Again, FBI surveillance teams documented her movements. She entered the store at approximately 6:35 p.m., browsed for approximately 15 minutes, purchased another publication, and exited. This time, rather than going to the coffee shop, she walked directly to the metro station and returned home. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Lindström visited the Open Book bookstore 6 times between February 7th and March 12th, 1980, approximately every 4 or 5 days. Each visit followed a similar pattern. She would arrive after work, browse the foreign language section, sometimes purchase items, and then either read in the nearby coffee shop or return home directly. FBI investigators began to develop a hypothesis. The bookstore might be serving as a signal site, a location where Lindström could indicate to her handler that she had information to pass or needed to receive instructions, and where her handler could similarly signal her. The mechanism might be simple. If Lindström visited on a certain day or at a certain time, or if she purchased a particular type of publication, or if she subsequently sat in the coffee shop for a specific duration, these actions could function as prearranged signals. Similarly, the unidentified man who had been observed at the coffee shop on February 7th might be her handler, using his own presence at the location as a signal or preparing for a dead drop exchange. On March 15, 1980, FBI investigators obtained authorization for more invasive surveillance measures. A court order was issued allowing the installation of a wiretap on Lindström's home telephone line. Additionally, the FBI contacted the management of the Open Book bookstore and, under conditions of strict confidentiality, installed a concealed camera inside the store that would record customers browsing and making purchases. The wiretap on Lindström's telephone, which was activated on March 17, 1980, initially produced only routine conversations. Lindström spoke with her mother in Oregon approximately once per week, usually on Sunday evenings. She spoke occasionally with friends making plans for lunch or social gatherings. She made mundane calls to schedule dental appointments, to order food delivery, to inquire about utility bills. There was nothing in any of these conversations that suggested intelligence activities. The camera installed in the Open Book bookstore captured Lindström's next visit on March 20th, 1980. The footage showed her entering the store at approximately 6:20 p.m., walking directly to the magazine rack that held Russian-language publications, selecting a journal titled Современная литература, Contemporary Literature, taking it to the counter, purchasing it, and departing. The entire transaction lasted approximately 7 minutes. FBI Russian-language specialists obtained a copy of the same journal Lindström had purchased and examined it thoroughly for any hidden messages, microdots, or other concealed communications. They found nothing unusual. It was simply a Soviet literary journal containing essays, book reviews, and excerpts from contemporary Russian fiction. If the journal was serving as a signaling mechanism, the signal was in the act of purchase itself, not in any content within the publication. The breakthrough in the investigation came not from the surveillance of Lindström, but from a separate investigation that was running in parallel. FBI investigators had been attempting to identify the unidentified man who had been observed at the coffee shop on February 7th. Enhanced photographs had been circulated within the FBI and CIA, and on March 27, 1980, a CIA officer reviewing the photographs identified the man as someone he had seen before but could not immediately place. After checking records, the CIA officer determined that the man in the photograph resembled an individual named David Arthur Hayes, age 43, who had worked briefly as a contract translator for the CIA in 1975. Hayes's CIA file indicated that he had been hired on a temporary contract basis to assist with translation of Russian technical documents. His contract had lasted 6 months, from April 1975 to October 1975, after which he had not been renewed for additional work. A background check conducted at the time of his hiring had found nothing disqualifying, though the check had been relatively basic given the temporary nature of the position and his lack of access to highly sensitive materials. FBI investigators obtained Hayes's current address and employment information. He was living in a townhouse in Bethesda, Maryland, and was working as a freelance translator, providing services to various government contractors, academic institutions, and private clients. He was unmarried, lived alone, and appeared to have no criminal record or previous security issues. On April 3, 1980, FBI agents placed Hayes under surveillance, similar to the surveillance being conducted on Lindström. For the first week, Hayes's activities appeared routine. He worked from his home office, occasionally met with clients, ran errands, and spent evenings at home. Then, on April 11, 1980, Hayes's routine changed in a way that immediately connected him to Rachel Lindström. At approximately 6:15 p.m. on April 11th, Hayes left his Bethesda townhouse and drove into Washington. He parked on a side street near DuPont Circle, walked to Connecticut Avenue, and entered the Open Book bookstore. FBI surveillance teams, now watching both Hayes and Lindström simultaneously from separate operations, documented that Lindström entered the same bookstore approximately 12 minutes after Hayes had entered. Inside the bookstore, concealed cameras captured both Hayes and Lindström browsing in different sections. They did not appear to interact directly. They did not speak to each other, did not make eye contact that was captured on camera, did not exchange any items. Hayes browsed for approximately 8 minutes. Purchased a newspaper, a Russian-language newspaper called Pravda, and departed. Lindström continued browsing for approximately another 6 minutes after Hayes had left, purchased a magazine, and then also departed. Both Hayes and Lindström then walked separately to the same coffee shop where Lindström had previously been observed. Hayes entered first and sat at a table near the back. Lindström entered approximately 4 minutes later and sat at a table on the opposite side of the room, approximately 20 feet from where Hayes was sitting. Both ordered coffee. Both appeared to read the publications they had purchased at the bookstore. FBI surveillance teams observing from outside the coffee shop reported that neither Lindström nor Hayes appeared to acknowledge each other's presence. They sat facing different directions, appeared absorbed in their reading, and gave no visible indication that they were aware of each other. After approximately 15 minutes, Hayes stood, gathered his things, and departed. Lindström remained seated and continued reading for approximately another 20 minutes before she also departed. To any casual observer, the scene would have appeared entirely unremarkable, two strangers independently visiting the same bookstore and coffee shop, pursuing their own activities, completely unconnected to each other. But FBI investigators, having now documented that Hayes and Lindström had been in the same locations at overlapping times on multiple occasions, began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what they might be observing. What appeared to be happening was an advanced counter-surveillance technique known as pattern obscuration, or sometimes called parallel movement. In this technique, an asset and a handler do not meet directly or exchange items obviously. Instead, they maintain what appears to be independent, coincidental presence in the same general locations, creating patterns that allow for signal passing or dead drop arrangements, while making it extremely difficult for surveillance teams to establish that any actual contact or coordination is occurring. For example, if Lindström visited the bookstore on a particular day, she might be signaling that she had information ready to pass. Hayes's presence at the bookstore and coffee shop might be his acknowledgement of that signal. The specific publications each purchased might contain coded information about where and when a dead drop would be placed and retrieved. The timing of their arrivals and departures might further refine these details, but because they never directly interacted, and because their activities individually appeared entirely innocent and routine, proving coordination was extremely difficult. On April 15th, 1980, FBI investigators made the decision to expand the investigation to include physical surveillance not just of Lindström and Hayes themselves, but of locations they visited after their encounters at the bookstore and coffee shop. The hypothesis was that if they were using the bookstore/coffee shop combination as a signaling site, they would likely subsequently visit separate locations to place and retrieve dead drops. The subsequent surveillance over the following 3 weeks documented several instances where Lindström or Hayes visited parks, libraries, or other public locations in the days following their bookstore encounters. FBI surveillance teams photographed these locations extensively, looking for any evidence of dead drop sites. Hollowed trees, loose bricks, magnetic key holders attached to metal surfaces under benches, or any of the dozens of other techniques commonly used for concealing and exchanging materials. On May 6, 1980, surveillance of Lindström captured her visiting Glover Archbold Park, a wooded area in northwest Washington. She entered the park at approximately 4:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, walking along one of the main trails. FBI agents on foot surveillance followed at a distance. Using multiple agents positioned at different points along the trail system to maintain visual contact while minimizing the risk of detection, Lindström walked for approximately 20 minutes along the trail, eventually stopping at a location where the trail crossed a small wooden footbridge over a stream. She stopped on the bridge, appeared to look down at the water, and remained there for approximately 2 minutes. Then she continued walking, completing a loop that brought her back to the park entrance, where she returned to her vehicle and drove home. FBI agents continued surveillance of the footbridge location for the next several hours. At approximately 7:45 p.m., after daylight had faded, David Hayes arrived at the park. He parked in a different parking area than Lindström had used, entered the park from a different trail, and walked along the trail network until he reached the same footbridge where Lindström had stopped earlier. He stopped on the bridge in nearly the same position where Lindström had stopped. Through night vision equipment, FBI agents observed Hayes reach down toward the underside of the bridge's railing, appear to manipulate something, and then withdraw his hand holding what appeared to be a small object. He placed this object inside his jacket pocket, continued walking across the bridge, and eventually returned to his vehicle and departed. After Hayes had left the park, FBI agents examined the footbridge using flashlights. On the underside of the bridge's wooden railing, they found a small piece of tape residue, suggesting that something had been attached there and recently removed. The location was photographed and documented. The FBI now had documentation of what appeared to be a dead drop operation. Lindström placing something at the footbridge, Hayes retrieving it several hours later. However, FBI agents had not actually seen Lindström place anything at the drop site. She had stopped on the bridge. But the surveillance footage had not captured a clear view of her hands or any placement action. Without either direct observation of the placement or recovery of actual materials exchanged, the case remained circumstantial. On May 14, 1980, FBI Director William Webster authorized a significant escalation of the investigation. The decision was made to attempt to apprehend Hayes immediately after his next suspected dead drop retrieval to search him for any materials he might have collected. And if such materials were found, to arrest both Hayes and Lindström and execute search warrants on their residences. The opportunity came on May 23, 1980. Surveillance teams documented Lindström visiting the DuPont Circle bookstore and coffee shop combination on the evening of May 21st. Hayes was observed at the same locations on the same evening, following the now familiar pattern. 2 days later, on May 23rd, Lindström was observed visiting Rock Creek Park during her lunch break from work. She walked along a trail, stopped at a location near a cluster of large rocks beside the trail, appeared to adjust her shoe while kneeling beside the rocks, and then continued walking back to her vehicle. FBI surveillance teams maintained constant watch on the rock cluster location. At approximately 8:15 p.m., after dark, Hayes arrived at Rock Creek Park. He walked along the same trail Lindström had walked. Reached the location where the rock cluster was positioned, knelt down as if to tie his shoe, reached toward the rocks, appeared to retrieve something small, placed it in his pocket, stood, and began walking back toward his vehicle. As Hayes walked back along the trail, FBI agents, positioned at multiple points, moved in and apprehended him. At 8:27 p.m., FBI Special Agent Michael Torres approached Hayes from behind, identified himself as FBI, and instructed Hayes to stop and place his hands where they could be seen. Hayes, according to the arrest report, appeared startled and initially began to back away, but when additional agents appeared from other positions along the trail, he complied with instructions to place his hands on his head and to kneel on the ground. Hayes was handcuffed and searched. In his right jacket pocket, agents found a small plastic film canister, approximately 1 inch in diameter and 2 inches long, sealed with a plastic cap. The canister was placed in an evidence bag. Hayes was advised of his rights and was transported to the FBI's Washington field office for questioning. Simultaneously, at approximately 8:30 p.m., FBI agents arrived at Rachel Lindström's apartment building in Arlington. They knocked on her apartment door, identified themselves as FBI when Lindström answered, presented her with an arrest warrant, and informed her she was under arrest on suspicion of espionage. Lindström, according to the arrest report, appeared shocked and confused. Her first words were, "There must be some mistake. I haven't done anything wrong." Lindström was also advised of her rights and was transported to the FBI Washington field office. Search teams entered both Lindström's apartment and Hayes's townhouse under authority of search warrants issued earlier that day. The film canister found in Hayes's pocket was opened under controlled conditions by FBI technical specialists. Inside the canister was a tightly rolled piece of photographic film, approximately 4 inches long, which appeared to be microfilm or microfiche. The film was developed and examined. It contained what appeared to be photographed pages of classified State Department documents, specifically cable traffic between the State Department and U.S. diplomatic posts concerning U.S.-Soviet relations and ongoing arms control negotiations. The discovery of the microfilm provided hard evidence that classified information was being passed. The documents photographed on the microfilm were identified as materials that Rachel Lindström would have had access to in her position as a translator in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Lindström was interrogated beginning in the early morning. Hours of May 24, 1980. The interrogation was conducted by FBI Special Agent Rebecca Walsh and CIA counterintelligence officer Jennifer Hammond, with a court-appointed attorney present at Lindström's request. Lindström initially denied any knowledge of espionage activities. She stated that she had never provided classified information to anyone, that she had never had contact with Soviet intelligence officers, and that she could not explain why microfilm containing classified documents had been found in David Hayes's possession. When presented with surveillance photographs showing her interaction with Yuri Sokolov on December 14, 1979, Lindström claimed she did not remember the encounter and suggested it might have been a routine interaction with a stranger experiencing car trouble. When presented with evidence of her repeated visits to the open book bookstore and the coffee shop in coordination with Hayes's visits, Lindström stated that these were coincidences and that she simply enjoyed reading Russian-language publications. The interrogation continued for approximately 6 hours, with breaks. Lindström maintained her denial throughout. However, according to interrogation logs, her demeanor shifted noticeably when investigators informed her that Hayes had been arrested and that classified documents had been found in his possession. She became visibly distressed and, according to Walsh's notes, appeared to be struggling with a decision about whether to continue denying involvement. At approximately 2 p.m. on May 24th, after consulting privately with her attorney, Lindström indicated she was willing to answer questions. What followed was a partial confession that would provide insight into one of the lesser-known aspects of Cold War espionage: recruitment through personal relationships. According to Lindström's statement, she had met David Hayes in 1977, approximately 1 year after she had begun working at the State Department. They had met at a lecture on Russian literature at Georgetown University, an event Lindström had attended out of personal interest in the subject matter. Hayes, who also attended the lecture, had struck up a conversation with Lindström afterward. They had discovered shared interests in Russian language and culture, had exchanged contact information, and had begun meeting occasionally for coffee or lunch to discuss books, films, and current events related to the Soviet Union. Over a period of months, according to Lindström's account, her relationship with Hayes had evolved from casual acquaintance to something more complex. Hayes had gradually begun expressing increasingly sympathetic views toward the Soviet Union, criticizing U.S. foreign policy, suggesting that the U.S. government was unnecessarily antagonistic toward Soviet leadership, and arguing that misunderstanding between the superpowers increased the risk of catastrophic war. Lindström stated that she had initially disagreed with some of Hayes's more pro-Soviet positions, but that over time, through their continued conversations and through materials Hayes had shared with her, articles, books, analyses, she had begun to question some of her own assumptions. She had begun to believe, or at least to entertain the possibility, that providing certain information to Soviet representatives might actually contribute to reducing misunderstanding and decreasing the risk of conflict. The turning point, according to Lindström, had occurred in late 1978 or early 1979 when Hayes had suggested that he had contacts with Soviet cultural representatives who might benefit from better understanding of U.S. positions on various issues. He had framed it as informal educational exchange, providing context and background that would help Soviet officials better understand American decision-making, not as espionage. Lindström stated that she had initially refused to provide any information, but that Hayes had continued to raise the subject gently, emphasizing that she would not be asked to provide anything that would harm U.S. security, only contextual information that would reduce the risk of miscalculation. Lindström's account suggested that her recruitment had been gradual, relationship-based, and accomplished through a combination of ideological persuasion, personal trust, and incremental normalization. Hayes had never presented himself as a Soviet intelligence officer or explicitly stated that he was asking Lindström to commit espionage. Instead, he had framed requests as contributions to peace, as acts of conscience, as ways to prevent misunderstanding that might lead to war. Lindström stated that her first actual provision of information had occurred in early 1979, when she had shared with Hayes unclassified summaries of U.S. positions on arms control negotiations. Hayes had expressed appreciation, had emphasized how helpful this context would be for Soviet representatives trying to understand American thinking, and had requested similar information in the future. Gradually, over months, the information Lindström provided had become more sensitive, though she claimed she had never provided anything she believed would directly harm U.S. security, a rationalization that FBI interrogators noted was common among individuals who commit espionage. The encounter with Yuri Sokolov on December 14, 1979, the encounter captured on surveillance video that had initiated the investigation, had been, according to Lindström, a signal meeting. Hayes had explained to Lindström that if he needed to communicate with her urgently, or if arrangements for dead drops needed to be confirmed, Lindström might be contacted by someone she didn't know who would appear to be experiencing car trouble at a specific location on Massachusetts Avenue. If Lindström walked past at approximately 12:20 p.m. on a Thursday, a specific day and time, and if she saw someone with car trouble at that location, and if that person made brief eye contact with her and gestured in a particular way, that was a signal that the dead drop schedule they had previously discussed was confirmed. Lindström was to acknowledge by nodding, continue walking, turn around after approximately 1 minute, walk back past the location, and adjust her handbag from one shoulder to the other as a confirmation signal. Lindström stated that she had found this entire procedure absurd and had believed she would never actually be contacted in this way. When the encounter with Sokolov had actually occurred on December 14th, she had been surprised, but had followed the procedure as Hayes had instructed. She had not known who Sokolov was and had assumed he was simply an intermediary working with Hayes's Soviet contacts. The dead drop operations Lindström described followed the pattern FBI surveillance had documented. Lindström would place photographed documents at prearranged locations. Hayes would retrieve them, and Hayes would presumably pass them to Soviet handlers, though Lindström claimed she had never seen this final transfer and had tried not to think too much about what happened to the information after she provided it to Hayes. When asked why she had committed espionage, Lindström's answers were complex and contradictory. At times, she emphasized her genuine belief that she was contributing to peace and reducing the risk of war. At other times, she acknowledged that she had enjoyed feeling important and valued, that Hayes's appreciation of her contributions had been personally validating, and that she had become increasingly invested in the relationship with Hayes, not romantically, she insisted, but as a connection that had become significant in her life. At still other times, she expressed confusion about her own motivations and stated that she had trouble understanding why she had made the choices she had made. David Hayes was interrogated separately, beginning on the evening of May 23, 1980. Unlike Lindström, Hayes exercised his right to remain silent and declined to answer substantive questions without legal representation present. When his court-appointed attorney arrived, Hayes was advised not to make any statements, and he complied with this advice. Search of Hayes's townhouse produced extensive evidence of espionage activities. FBI agents found in a locked filing cabinet in Hayes's home office a Minox subminiature camera designed for photographing documents, approximately 24 rolls of unexposed microfilm, a set of one-time pad cipher sheets used for encrypted communications, $8,400 in cash in unmarked bills, and handwritten notes describing dead drop locations, signal sites, and operational procedures. Additionally, agents found correspondence that suggested Hayes had been in contact with Soviet intelligence for considerably longer than Lindström had been. Letters and notes dating back to 1974, a year before Hayes had worked his temporary contract with the CIA, suggested that Hayes might have been a Soviet asset even at the time he was briefly employed by U.S. intelligence. Though what information he might have accessed or provided during that period was difficult to determine. Rachel Lindström and David Hayes were both charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage, with unauthorized communication of national defense information to a foreign government, and with related offenses. The charges carried potential sentences of up to life imprisonment. The case was assigned to Judge Martin Feldman of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Lindström eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a recommended sentence reduction. She provided detailed testimony about her recruitment, her activities, the information she had passed, and her interactions with Hayes. She also provided information about Yuri Sokolov and the signal meeting, though she had little knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations beyond her own direct involvement. Hayes, even after being confronted with the extensive evidence found in his home and Lindström's testimony, continued to decline to cooperate with investigators. He entered a plea of not guilty and proceeded to trial. The trial began in October 1980. Federal prosecutors presented the surveillance footage from December 14, 1979, showing Lindström's interaction with Sokolov. They presented evidence of Lindström and Hayes's coordinated visits to the bookstore and coffee shop. They presented surveillance documentation of the dead drop operations at both Glover Archbold Park and Rock Creek Park. They presented the microfilm found in Hayes's possession containing photographed classified documents. They presented the espionage equipment and materials found in Hayes's home. They presented Lindström's testimony describing her recruitment and her activities, and they presented expert testimony from intelligence analysts describing the damage to U.S. national security caused by the compromise of the classified information. Hayes's defense attorney argued that the government had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Hayes had actually passed the materials to Soviet intelligence, only that he had received them from Lindström. The attorney suggested that Hayes might have been engaged in private research or journalism rather than espionage. The argument was not particularly persuasive given the espionage equipment and operational materials found in Hayes's home, but the attorney was obligated to present the best defense available. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Hayes showed no visible reaction when the verdict was announced. Lindström, who had pleaded guilty as part of her cooperation agreement, was sentenced in November 1980. Judge Feldman, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged Lindström's cooperation and her apparent remorse, but emphasized the seriousness of her betrayal of trust and the damage caused to national security. He sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after serving approximately 5 years. Hayes was sentenced in December 1980. Judge Feldman's remarks at Hayes's sentencing were considerably harsher than those at Lindström's sentencing. Feldman noted that Hayes had been the recruiter and handler, had manipulated Lindström for espionage purposes, had shown no remorse, and had declined to cooperate with investigators. Feldman sentenced Hayes to 40 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. Yuri Sokolov, the Soviet diplomat who had been captured on surveillance video in the signal meeting with Lindström, was declared persona non grata by the U.S. State Department and was expelled from the United States in June 1980, shortly after Lindström and Hayes's arrests. He returned to the Soviet Union, where his subsequent career is not documented in available records. The damage assessment prepared by U.S. intelligence agencies in the months following the arrests concluded that Lindström and Hayes's espionage had compromised multiple classified State Department communications regarding U.S. negotiating positions on arms control, U.S. assessments of Soviet political leadership, and internal U.S. discussions about policy toward the Soviet Union. The assessment concluded that this information had provided Soviet intelligence with insight into American thinking and had potentially influenced Soviet negotiating strategies. However, as with most espionage cases, the actual practical impact of the intelligence provided is difficult to measure definitively. Arms control negotiations during this period were complex and influenced by numerous factors. Whether specific information from Lindström and Hayes meaningfully affected outcomes is impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain is the impact on the individuals involved. Rachel Lindström served 9 years of her 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 1989. During her time in prison, she was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia. Her mother visited occasionally during the first few years, though these visits became less frequent over time. Lindström's father died in 1984, and Lindström was not permitted to attend his funeral. Upon her release in 1989, Lindström returned to Oregon, where her elderly mother still lived. She attempted to rebuild her life, though finding employment was difficult given her espionage conviction. She worked various jobs: retail clerk, library assistant, administrative temp work, none of which utilized her education or language skills. According to people who knew her during this period, she lived quietly, avoided discussing her past, and struggled with depression and isolation. Lindström's mother died in 1997. After her mother's death, Lindström became increasingly reclusive. She moved to a small apartment in a different Oregon city, supported herself through part-time work and minimal savings, and had virtually no social connections. According to interviews conducted years later with researchers studying Cold War espionage cases, Lindström expressed profound regret for her actions, though she struggled to articulate exactly when and why she had made the choice to commit espionage. She described her recruitment by Hayes as a gradual loss of judgment and stated that she had felt as though she was making small, incremental decisions that somehow accumulated into something she had never intended to become. When asked about the December 14, 1979 encounter with Yuri Sokolov, the surveillance footage that had initiated the investigation, Lindström stated that she remembered feeling frightened and foolish as she walked past the vehicle, turned around, and walked past again. She remembered thinking that the entire procedure was theatrical and absurd, and she remembered wondering whether she was being watched, though she had seen no signs of surveillance. She stated that she had hoped at the time that no one was paying attention to her, and that the irony of this hope, given what had actually transpired, was not lost on her. Rachel Lindström died in 2006 at the age of 55 from pancreatic cancer. Her obituary in the local Oregon newspaper made no mention of her espionage conviction or her time in prison, listing only her birth date, death date, and noting that she had worked as a translator and had been predeceased by her parents. There was no mention of survivors. The obituary indicated that services were private. According to records, she was buried in a public cemetery in a simple grave with a modest marker bearing only her name and dates. David Hayes served 32 years of his 40-year sentence before dying in federal prison in 2012 at the age of 75. He was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, for the majority of his sentence. According to prison records, he maintained his silence throughout his incarceration, never providing information to investigators about his recruitment by Soviet intelligence, his other activities, or any other assets he might have recruited. He had no family who visited him. He had been unmarried, had no children, and his parents had died years before his arrest. He spent decades in prison largely alone, working in the prison library and declining most social interactions with other inmates. What motivated Hayes to become a Soviet asset in the first place remains unclear. Unlike Lindström, whose recruitment process was at least partially documented through her own testimony, Hayes's initial contact with Soviet intelligence is not known. Some investigators speculated that he might have been recruited during a period he spent in Europe in the late 1960s or early 1970s. Others suggested he might have been an ideological volunteer who had approached Soviet intelligence on his own initiative. Still, others noted that the substantial amount of cash found in his home suggested financial motivation. The truth, what Hayes believed, what he hoped to accomplish, what he thought his espionage would achieve, died with him. Thomas Garrett, the CIA Technical Services officer who had first reviewed the surveillance footage on December 18, 1979, and whose careful documentation had initiated the investigation, received a commendation for his work on the case. He continued working in technical surveillance analysis until his retirement from the CIA in 1992. In interviews he gave years later, Garrett reflected on the case as an example of how even routine surveillance work could suddenly become consequential. He noted that he had reviewed thousands of hours of similar footage both before and after the Lindström-Hayes case, most of which had documented nothing significant, and that the footage from December 14, 1979, had initially appeared no different from any other routine surveillance tape until certain patterns had emerged and connections had been made. Jennifer Hammond, the CIA counterintelligence officer who had identified the pattern of roadside encounters and had initiated the enhanced investigation, also received recognition for her analytical work. She continued working counterintelligence cases until 2001, when she retired after 38 years with the CIA. In later interviews, she emphasized that the Lindström-Hayes case demonstrated the importance of cross-referencing seemingly unrelated incidents and looking for patterns across multiple surveillance operations. She noted that without the systematic review of multiple reports from different Soviet diplomats, the December 14th encounter between Lindström and Sokolov would likely have been dismissed as coincidental, and the espionage operation might have continued undetected for much longer. The surveillance camera system that had captured the original footage, the Operation Lighthouse system, remained operational throughout the 1980s and was eventually replaced by more advanced technologies in the 1990s. The system captured footage that contributed to numerous other counterintelligence investigations during its operational period, though the Lindström-Hayes case remained its most significant early success. The Open Book bookstore on Connecticut Avenue, which had served as an unwitting signal site for Lindström and Hayes's operation, continued operating as a bookstore until 1995, when it closed due to financial difficulties unrelated to its role in the espionage case. The coffee shop where Lindström and Hayes had conducted their parallel visits closed in 2003 and was replaced by a different business. The locations where dead drops had been placed, the footbridge in Glover Archbold Park, the rock cluster in Rock Creek Park, remained ordinary features of those parks, visited by thousands of hikers and walkers who had no awareness of their brief role in Cold War espionage history. The broader questions raised by the Lindström-Hayes case concern the nature of recruitment, the power of gradual manipulation, and the human capacity for rationalization. Rachel Lindström was not someone who set out to become a spy. By all accounts, she was an ordinary person with conventional values who believed herself to be loyal to her country. Her transformation from a conscientious State Department translator into an active espionage asset occurred gradually through a combination of relationship development, ideological persuasion, and incremental compromise. The question of responsibility in cases like Lindström's is complicated because it requires understanding the interplay between individual choice and manipulative influence. Lindström chose to provide classified information to Hayes. She chose to participate in signal meetings and dead drop operations. She chose to continue these activities over a period of months. Those choices were hers. And she bore responsibility for them and their consequences. But Lindström also made those choices within a relationship that Hayes had deliberately cultivated for the purpose of recruitment. She made them after being exposed to months of carefully tailored arguments designed to make espionage seem like a reasonable, even ethical, response to legitimate concerns about war and peace. She made them while believing, or at least telling herself she believed, that she was contributing to understanding rather than committing betrayal. The extent to which Hayes's manipulation diminished Lindström's responsibility is a question without a clear answer. For David Hayes, the moral complexity is different. If Hayes was indeed a knowing Soviet intelligence asset who recruited Lindström for the purpose of espionage, and the evidence suggests he was, then his actions represented a calculated betrayal that involved not only espionage against his own country, but also the manipulation and exploitation of another person for intelligence purposes. Whether Hayes believed his espionage served some higher purpose, or whether he was motivated primarily by financial gain, or whether some combination of factors drove his actions, remains unknown because he never explained himself. The surveillance tape recorded on December 14, 1979, remains in archives as evidence, as historical record, as training material for intelligence professionals. Video footage can only capture surfaces. It shows what happened but not why, documents actions but not motivations, preserves moments but not the context of fear, rationalization, belief, or regret that might have accompanied them. Those 8 minutes captured the intersection of Soviet intelligence operations, American counterintelligence response, individual choices made under complex circumstances, systemic vulnerabilities in personnel security, and human relationships that were simultaneously genuine and manipulative, intimate and exploitative, trusting and betraying. The footage documents how espionage sometimes looks, not dramatic or cinematic, but ordinary, banal, easy to miss unless someone is watching carefully and knows what to look for. The ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect, that betrayal can look, on surveillance tape, exactly like everyday life, and that the destruction of lives can begin with actions so mundane that they might otherwise be forgotten entirely. Rachel Lindström was 28 years old when the surveillance camera captured her walking past Yuri Sokolov's vehicle on Massachusetts Avenue. She was 29 when she was arrested. She was 38 when she was released from prison. She was 55 when she died, having spent more than half her adult life dealing with the consequences of choices she had made over a period of months in 1979 and early 1980. In the years before her death, she told an interviewer that she thought about those choices constantly, that she had replayed the progression of her recruitment endlessly in her mind, trying to identify the specific moment when she could have or should have refused, when she could have stepped back from the path Hayes had guided her down. She said she could never identify that single moment because there hadn't been one. It had been a series of small steps, each of which had seemed manageable or justifiable at the time, but which collectively had led her somewhere she had never intended to go. David Hayes was 43 years old when he recruited Lindström. He was 75 when he died in prison, believing, or perhaps not believing, it is impossible to know, that whatever cause he had served, whatever purpose he had thought his espionage would accomplish, had been worth the decades he spent incarcerated and the life he had destroyed in the process of serving that cause.